All right, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, so today we will continue our discussion. First, I'm going to finish the earlier chapter that talk about the comparative advantage and the gain from international trade. And after that, so we are going to move to next chapter, right? So basically, so we are going to look at supply and demand. So that's the plan, right? So first, let's quickly wrap up this earlier chapter. So in that chapter, we talk about the comparative advantage. What is comparative advantage? Comparative advantage means you have lower opportunity costs in producing a particular goods, right? And then what is absolute advantage? Absolute advantage says you can produce more of that particular thing. Okay, so you have comparative advantage. Sorry, you have absolute advantage. Doesn't means you have comparative advantage, right? So you can have absolute advantage for both you can produce, but you can only have comparative advantage for one thing, right? So that is that's a principle, right? Now, sorry. Now let's look at a few practice questions we did not finish, and then so we move to next chapter. So I believe we have seen this before, right? So this practice question, we have seen this before. So now let's see what it is. So if Victexia specialized in food, it can produce 1,000 units of food and 0 unit of clothing this year. If it specializes in clothing, it can produce 500 units of clothing and 0 unit of food. This year, Urbana can produce either 500 units of food or 0 unit of clothing and 200 unit of clothing and 0 unit of food. Who has absolute advantage and who has absolute advantage in producing clothing and who has absolute advantage in producing food, right? So the best way we do is just write down or write a table for both economy, right? So you have Texia, that's short for T, and then you have Urbania, short for U. Okay, Texia, so they can either produce 1,000 or 0 versus 0 or 500. Urbania, so they can produce 500 food versus 0 unit clothing or 0 unit food, 200 unit of clothing. And from here, clearly you can see Texia has absolute advantage in both food because 1,000 is greater than 500. And in the production of food, sorry, this clothing, this food. So food, because they can produce 500 versus 200 in Urbania. Right? So Texia has absolute advantage in producing both, right? But however, one country or one economy has absolute advantage in producing both doesn't mean it can have comparative advantage in everything. That's impossible. Now let's look at next one. Okay, so unfortunately, so we have to rewrite what we just erased. So the 1,000 versus 0 and 0 versus 500. And here is 500 versus 0 and 0 versus 250. Now, this question asks you who has comparative advantage in production of clothing. All right, so now let's see. So there are opportunity costs of producing clothing. For textile, so the opportunity cost of producing clothing. Right, so in order to produce 1,000 clothing, they give up 500 food. Meaning, so the opportunity cost of clothing is going to be 500. That's the cost they give up, divided by 1,000. Now we look at Urbania, right? So in order to produce 500, they give up 200 food, 250, sorry, 250 divided by 500. Wait, apologize. So there's a mistake. So this will be 200, 200. All right, and then so clearly you can see Urbania has comparative advantage in closing. Because for Urbania, so it's going to cost them 2/5. But for Texia, it's going to cost them 1/2. Right? So 2/5 is less than 1/2. So Urbania has comparative advantage in the production of clothing. And then alternatively, Texia must has comparative advantage in the production of food. Wait, sorry. Did I miss a number? Let me read again. Right. Texia, Urbania. All right, so 1,000 food versus 0 clothing, and 0 food and 500 clothing. Other one is 500 food and 0 clothing, or 0 food, 200 clothing. Right? Now we need to find out who has comparative advantage in the production of clothing. So I guess I messed up with the order. So this is food versus clothing. Food versus clothing. Now we want to look at clothing. I see. So I flip. So clothing. So the opportunity cost of the production of clothing in textile is going to be let me write it here, 1,000 divided by 500. Right? Because in order to produce 500 clothing, textile must give up 1,000 food. So that's going to give you 2. 2 is the opportunity cost of clothing in textile. On the other hand, in order to produce 200 clothing in Urbania, so they must give up 500 food. So then the opportunity cost is going to be 500 divided by 200. So that's going to give you 2.5. So hence, textile has lower opportunity cost, 2 versus 2.5 in Urbania. So textile has comparative advantage in the production of clothing. And then alternatively, Urbania must has a comparative advantage in the production of food. All right. Sorry for the confusion because I was I didn't write correctly in terms of order. All right. So now we go to next one. If a country specializes according to its own comparative advantage and then trade with other nations, A, it will operate at a point inside its PPF. That's not occurring. B, it can consume at a higher level than the domestic PPF. That is correct. C, its PPF will shift or rotate inward. No, so its own PPF won't change. But however, the world PPF, when I say world, think about 2 country case, meaning so their joint production will exceed what was possible if they produce without cooperation, right? Last one, it can consume at the same level as domestic PPF. So if it's the same, then there's no point of trade, right? So there's no principle of a comparative advantage. Now we have one more. Okay, so we already done this. Now, one more. Suppose that in Australia, it takes 2 hours to harvest 100 bushels of apples. Now let me write here. Australia, so 2 hours to harvest, 2 hours, harvest 10 bushels of apples. 4 hours to harvest 10 bushels of tomato. Okay, let's write here, Australia. Okay, and then here, so I'm gonna write Brazil. Okay, now let's see, so what they can produce. Start with Australia. 2 hours harvest 10 bushels apples. Okay, so why not we normalize the time, right? Say, let me 4 hours, okay, so let's just look at how much they can produce in 1 hour, right? So in 1 hour, they're going to harvest how many apples? They're going to have 5 apples. Okay, let's say 5A. All right, so there's one question from student. Says, did he say he record his lecture and put them on the canvas? If so, where do I find them? Okay, so actually I have record everything and I put everything on YouTube channel. So I send everyone an email. I send everyone an email with a link. Okay, so if you did not receive that, so I'm going to send you the link again. Because remember, so every day, so we have a short break. So I'm going to send you the link during our short break today. Thanks for that. Okay, so now back to our business. So Australia in 2 hours, they can harvest 10 bushels apples. Meaning for each hour, they can have 5 apples, right? Or 0 tomato, okay? Or alternatively, so if they spend all the time on tomato, then 0 apple. How many tomato? So 4 hours, they're gonna harvest 10 bushels of tomato, meaning, so each hour, they can have 2.5 tomato, right? So remember here, so what I'm trying to do is just convert everything in per hour. Just make the calculation comparable or easier. Everything's in 1 hour, right? Now we do the same thing for Brazil. So Brazil, so if they spend all time in apple, 4 hours, they can harvest 10, meaning each hour they can have 2.5 apple and then 0 tomato. Or if they spend all time in tomato, 0 apple, how many tomato? 10 bushels in 5 hours, meaning 2 tomato, right? So now if we compare A versus B, A stands for Australia, B stands for Brazil, right? And then now, so if we look at the comparison, it becomes clear. First of all, Australia has absolute advantage because Australia can produce more apple and more tomato. This is number one. Now, who has comparative advantage? Start with Apple. So the opportunity cost of Apple in Australia now go to here. Right, so the opportunity cost of Apple and opportunity cost of tomato. That's Apple. Okay. Start with Australia. The opportunity cost of Apple in Australia is going to be 2.5. That's what they need to give up, divided by 5, right? So this is Australia. Now in Brazil, so what is the opportunity cost of Apple? So they must give up 2 versus 2.5, right? So they give up 2 tomatoes to produce 2.5 apples, right? And then so here you can clearly see opportunity cost of Apple is smaller in Australia. So this one is smaller than this one. So this opportunity cost of Apple. Now to confirm the case why one country can only have comparative advantage in one thing, we can look at the opportunity cost of tomato. Okay, so the opportunity cost of tomato in Australia, then it's going to be, so look at tomato, right? So they want to produce tomato, 2.5. This is what they want again. Then they give out 5 apples, right? Divided by 5. Oh, Wait. Okay, opportunity cost of tomato. So opportunity cost of tomato in Australia. So in order to produce tomato, wait, sorry. I believe I flipped the sign. Now let's back to apple again. I apologize. Opportunity cost of apple. Okay, so opportunity cost of apple in Australia. So in order to produce 5 apples, they must give up 2.5 tomato. I think it was correct. And then so they give up 2 tomatoes to gain 2.5 apples. Opportunity cost, right, 2.5. So tomato now, so in order to produce 2.5 tomatoes, they give up 5 apples. And then in order to produce 2 tomatoes, they give up 2.5 apples. Right, so opportunity cost of apple is smaller in Australia. Opportunity cost of tomato is going to be smaller in where? Brazil, right? So now we look at the options. Option 1, Brazil has a comparative advantage in producing tomato. This is true. This is true, right? Brazil has a comparative advantage in producing tomato because Brazil has lower opportunity costs. Right? Okay, B, Brazil has a comparative advantage in producing apple. This is not true. Actually, the opportunity cost of apple is smaller in Australia. Now C, Brazil has an absolute advantage in producing both goods. So this exactly wrong, exact opposite, right? Because Australia actually has absolute advantage in producing both goods because 5 is greater than 2.5 and 2.5 is greater than 2. So this is not correct. D, in trade between these two countries, Australia would gain and Brazil would lose. That's against the principle of comparative advantage. So actually, the principle of comparative advantage tells us both countries will gain. Even Australia has absolute advantage in producing both goods, right? So A is correct. All right, so I'm going to skip this part because we have another video to watch at the end of the today's class. So now we move to next chapter. Okay, so in this chapter, we are going to discuss demand and supply. And this is the last chapter we are going to review before our first midterm. Right. So in this chapter, what are we going to discuss? We are going to look at first, what does it mean a competitive market? And then so we're going to look at demand versus supply. Okay. And then finally, we are going to look at demand and supply jointly and then see how market equilibrium is going to achieve. And then there, so we can talk about the invisible hands. All right. So this is a roadmap of the current chapter. All right. Now let's first see what does competitive market means. A competitive market means there are many buyers and sellers of the same goods or service, and none of whom can influence the price. Okay? So let me explain to you what this means. If we can draw a diagram, on the horizontal line, we have number of buyers. On the vertical line, we have numbers of sellers. Okay? And here, let's just start with 1. And here means you have 1 buyer and 1 seller. And then here means you have many buyers but 1 seller. And here means you have 1 buyer but many sellers. And finally here, this big triangle means you have many buyers and sellers. And then remember here we talk about the market for a particular goods or the same goods. Okay, so remember this is 1. Now this triangle is going to represent competitive market. Okay? In this competitive market, we have so many identical sellers and so many identical buyers. It turns out no one in the market can influence the price. The example of competitive market, think about in these days, think about grocery stores. So most of the goods we purchase in a grocery store are in a competitive market. All right, so this is an example of competitive market. Now, let's look at non-competitive market. First, look at here. We have 1 or a few sellers. Sorry, we have 1 or few sellers here, but we have many buyers. Right? What is the example? So in our daily life, think about utility company. And typically in the city, we have 1 utility company. Right? Or think about internet provider. In Omaha, we have 2 or 3 internet provider, CenturyLink, Cox. Right? So you have very few sellers, but you have many buyers. And we call this monopoly. Okay? And in this monopoly market, a few sellers, in some sense, they can have a strong influence over the price. But in competitive market, because we have so many sellers, no one has the ability to influence the price. Right? So now we go to other extreme. So you have 1 or very few buyers, but you have many sellers. Example could be healthcare or particularly Medicare. Medicare, in the Medicare, so essentially who is the buyer? The government is the sole buyers. The government purchases healthcare from hospitals, from health providers, from nursing home. Right? So in this particular market, we have only 1 buyers, but you have many different sellers because there are so many hospitals. There are so many healthcare providers. They provide healthcare to senior citizens who are covered by Medicare. Right? And then, so in that sense, the government has the power or the ability to affect the price of healthcare. And in this market, it's called monopoly. Okay? This is opposite to monopoly. All right. Now, in this class, we are going to focus on competitive market, meaning there are so many identical buyers and sellers. None of them can influence price. And the supply and demand model we are going to study is going to be a model to understand how a competitive market behaves. So that's the goal of this chapter. Now we are going to start with demand. Okay. What is demand? Demand represents the behavior of buyers. Remember, this is behavior and the behavior of buyers. Now, a demand curve shows the quantity demanded at different prices. But what is quantity demanded? Quantity demanded is the quantity that buyers are willing to purchase at a particular price. Right? Okay, now we may want to use examples to see what does demand curve means and what is quantity demanded. In this background picture, to kind of give us the idea of quantity demanded. Right? So the quantity demanded has two things I want to emphasize. One is willing. The other is able. In this background picture, so this old gentleman, so he's able to buy this scooter, but he may not want to buy this scooter due to the health risk. All right, so now let's see examples. So we are going to look at the market for cotton. All right, and we have a demand schedule. The demand schedule just shows you how quantity demanded on the right side of the table, change with price of cotton on the left side of the table. Okay. So when the price is 7.1, and then the demand, when the price is 2, the quantity demanded will be 7.1. And that's represented by this dot on the figure in the left. So in the figure on the left, what do we have? We have quantity demanded on the horizontal line, we have price on the vertical line. Okay, and so given price of 2, so you have a demand of 7.1. So this is the first observation. When price increase from 7.1 to 7.5, now we see the, so when price decreased from 2.0 to 1.75, the quantity demand increased from 7.1 to 7.5. Now we move to this dot. Okay, and we continue this process. You're going to see as the price keep decline, the quantity demanded will increase. And finally, if we connect those dots together, we are going to have a demand curve. The demand curve says as price falls, the quantity demanded rise. So we are going to see an economic explanation why this is true, right? But in a later slide. But for now, I want to emphasize we want to differentiate between two closely related concepts. A change in demand is not the same as change in quantity demanded. How they are different. Now let me explain to you how they are different. Use the graphs. Okay. A change in demand means the demand curve itself, change in demand means so the curve is going to shift, right? Means if the price stay the same, the quantity demanded will be different. Then there's a change in demand. It can be increasing or decreasing. Now, when price fixed, but you see a different quantity demanded. Okay, so this change in demand on the left-hand side. Now we look at right hand side, change in quantity demanded. So change in quantity demanded says the demand curve itself doesn't change. Okay, what change is, so we just move along this curve. When the price drop from 1 to 0.5, and then the quantity demanded will increase from 10 to 14.2. All right. To summarize, when we say there's a change in quantity demanded, the demand curve stay the same. But when we say there's a change in demand, the demand curve is going to move. Now we have law of demand. The law of demand says a higher price for goods and service leads to people to demand a smaller quantity. Okay? To summarize, price increase leads to quantity demanded decrease. Price decrease leads to quantity demanded increase. So this is law of demand. Okay. Now we are going to look at what can we are going to look at the shift of the demand curve, and then so we are going to see what can cause shifts of the demand curve. The shift of the demand curve can be different. So if the curve shift to leftward, and then so, or in other words, if you are seeing a curve shift to left hand side, like I just draw on the slides, then we say this is a decrease in demand. Right? So now I need to explain to you why this is a decrease in demand. Right. So we can compare this point versus this point. Let's label them. Right, so this is, let's call A, B, and a C. So before there's a decrease in demand curve, meaning we are in D1. Right? Okay, when we are in the D1, if price is 8, your demand is going to be, sorry, when price is 1. When price is $1, your demand is going to be 8. Now, under the new demand curve of D2, the same price, the demand will decrease to 7. Price stay the same, but the quantity demanded decline. So that reflects a decrease in demand. Now, so you are willing to buy less, even price stay the same. So this is one way to look at it. You compare A versus B, right? Because A is the point on new demand curve, and also A is what is when we observe the same price as before, right? The other way to look at decrease in demand is by comparing A versus C. Okay, so this just says, okay, so before you want to buy 7 at a price of 2. Now at the new demand curve, in order to keep the demand intact, so the customer only willing to pay $1. Or in other words, if you want me to buy 7 units, you must decrease your price from 2 to 1. Your willingness to buy decrease. So this other way to look at why there's a decrease if we move from D1 to D2. Right. Okay. Opposite to a decrease in demand, then we have increase in demand. When the curve shifts to the right hand side, and then so we are going to have an increase in demand. Now let's see it again. Now, so if the curve shifts to the right, we are going to see an increase in demand. And similarly, we have two ways to understand. Now let's label them again. So we compare this point A versus this point B and this point C. So if we compare A to C, right, price stay at $1. Now consumer is going to demand 15 versus 10, meaning the demand is strong, right? Price keep the same, but you demand more. Or alternatively, we can look at A versus B. So keep the quantity constant. The customer will pay $2 instead of $1. Their willingness to pay increase, meaning the demand is strong. All right. Okay, so we are going to take a 5 minutes break.